This is the Observations Podcast for Sunday, the 12th of May, 2024. We are still waiting for Michael to join us. He's a little bit late today. I'm sure he'll be with us in a few minutes because I've already texted him. We've already talked about what we're going to speak about today. And in fact, the blue admit button is now flashing for me, which means that Michael should be with us pretty quick here. I'll go ahead and bring up the screen so that we can actually see both of us on here. And then as soon as Michael is able to hook up, he will go ahead and say hi. In the meantime, to go ahead and get started. Aha, there he is.
Hi.
Hello, Michael. How are you?
Sorry for being late.
That's all right. Oh, your volume is way low today for some reason. I gotta fix that. All right. Hopefully that'll be a little bit better. The music was kind of drowning you out. So, hey, it's been a week since we talked, so good to see you again. And I'm glad you're here because we need some we need some lawyer talk today.
Oh, yay.
Because of, now, granted, you are not a federal criminal lawyer. So,
that's right.
So we will acknowledge that. But some interesting stuff has been happening this week in Donald Trump's various court cases. First of all, the classified documents case. It's on hold indefinitely now. Judge Cannon has said that there are so many motions on both sides to go through that a July trial date is just not on the table. So she has postponed it indefinitely, and in fact is not even set to rule, I guess, on a lot of these motions until July. So May, June. So she's giving herself basically 2 months to rule on these things. So we have a whole set of people talking about the delays. This is the headline about the delay. What I was really interested in is the response, and not just the response, but I want to point out something about the response. So this is the
response from whom?
That's the question. That is the thing I want to point out. So they've decided, okay, well, Judge Cannon has decided to postpone this indefinitely, and they explain why. And so they began to reach out to people for comment. So the first person they reached out is a former U.S. attorney and frequent critic of the former president. The second person that they decided to reach out to was Joyce Vance, a former U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Alabama under the Barack Obama administration. So these are the two people, these are their two go-to people for commentary on the delay in the trial. And of course, both of them don't like Trump, and both of them have very negative things to say about it, which we'll get into in a moment. I find it very interesting that they couldn't talk to anyone. They couldn't find anyone.
Turley, Alan Dershowitz.
Yeah, who would say, "Oh, yeah, this is a good thing." So the framing in which
it's not really a good or bad thing, to be honest, but go ahead.
Yeah, but the framing in which we get from, in this case, Newsweek, is that they go straight to critics of Trump and they go to them for quotes about why it's a bad thing. And so the story then is that it is governmental insanity. There's our headline. No opposing voices, no nothing. You think you hate the media, but you don't hate them enough.
It's true.
And one of the ways in which you can tell, and I'm not a lawyer, let me make that clear, but I am smart enough to know when somebody is gaslighting me. And one of the ways that you can judge the honesty of these arguments is whether you're being gaslighted. And so I want to point out what this guy says. Judge Eileen Cannon is single-handedly depriving the American people of our right to a fair and timely trial of Donald Trump.
It's not a thing.
We have no such right. The right to a fair and timely trial is a right that Donald Trump possesses. It's not a right that we possess. The American people technically have no interest whatsoever in Donald Trump's right to a speedy trial, except insofar as it impacts our potential right to a fair and speedy trial. Beyond that, this is a right solely of Donald Trump. And I think the way in which he frames this is very telling. Because he is a former U.S. attorney. Presumably, he knows that this is a misstatement of the law and a misstatement of the Constitution. So I have to assume.
I would hope.
So I have to assume that this is purposeful. But it is not only the American people's right to a fair and timely trial of Donald Trump, but a fair and timely trial of Donald Trump on those most dangerous criminal offenses he committed. Has he been convicted of this? What offenses has he committed? We have allegations, but we don't have convictions. And
this is why newspapers always use the term alleged.
Yeah, allegedly.
Right.
Which we've been known to use ourselves. This, I think, is less tendentious. Joyce Vance says the case could and should have been ready for trial in December or January if she'd been working on the motions and realistic deadlines all along. Okay, well, I don't know whether that is true or not, because I think it depends on the exact nature of the motions.
Well, it also depends on Judge Cannon's docket. I mean, she's not handling one case and one case only. I mean, she is a district court judge. She has to handle every case that comes before her. So she can't give priority to only one case.
Right. However, one of the little lines here is the Speedy Trial Act. And Vance says that the Speedy Trial Act directs judges to set a trial date at the beginning of a case before motions are even filed, which is true, but Judge Cannon set a trial date.
Yeah.
She set a trial date for July 6th, I believe it was.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, and that is, in fact, the date that is being postponed.
Right.
And what should go in here somewhere, and is nowhere that I can find, which is that what counts as a speedy trial and who is affected most by a speedy trial depends largely on whether the defendant wants to have that speedy trial. And if the defendant has asked for a delay, it seems to me that the presupposition should be that the defense gets their delay. I mean, as long as the grounds are rational and reasonable. It can't just be because I don't want to, but sure.
It is a very common strategy in criminal cases for the defense to try to delay as much as possible so it can gather evidence, so that it can question witnesses, so it can prepare its case. Going too speedy is rarely in the defendant's favor. So this isn't unusual. What's unusual is the sheer number of pretrial motions that are going to arise from all the shenanigans that have gone on. The admissions from the prosecutorial team that they, played a little fast and loose with the evidence, were not honest in how they presented the evidence, nor were they honest in the affidavits when they presented the evidence. So this creates a bit of a morass, and that's all the prosecution's doing. That has nothing to do with the defense.
Yeah, I should point out that this previous week, in a motion in front of Judge Cannon about the actual state of the evidence that the FBI gathered at Mar-a-Lago and has been storing since and has been referring to since, is that there is a discrepancy between the order in which these documents appear in the boxes and the order in which they were recorded. And their explanation was, well, a lot of these boxes weren't full and they were kind of, the documents were kind of small, so maybe they got shuffled while we were moving them around.
It's just bullshit. I mean, look, here's the thing.
And I read the
They
motion, by the way.
arranged-
I read the motion, by the way, and that's what they said.
Right.
These are small items, and they were probably jostled.
They are so full of shit. They specifically arranged certain documents. They brought in classified folders to cover these documents, and they say to use as placeholders these, I guess, intelligence level sheets to insert
Classified cover
places.
sheets.
Right. And if we take them at their word, I mean, that's fine, but that's not how they presented the evidence. Matter of fact, they presented the photos of all these documents on the ground with cover sheets on them and these scary looking, classified info cover sheets and folders, and said that this is why it's so important that we need not only to raid Mar-a-Lago, but we need to prevent the defense from having any control whatsoever over these documents and the dissemination of these documents. Not only that, but as what's her name?
But by the way, let's point out something, and you've implied it, but have not explicitly stated it. Those were the FBI's cover sheets.
Right.
Those were the ones that they bought along. And so those photos they took were basically staged photos where they strategically placed their own,
which they used as evidence, and they have affidavits, which you have to have in order to back up those photos. And they lied. They absolutely lied.
Yeah, because that was not the state in which they found the documents. Those classified cover sheets were not with those documents. That was all supplied by the FBI. The FBI staged those photos. And, of course, now we know that they staged those photos. And yet they had them in as evidence, which means they falsified affidavits to put them in as evidence.
Yes, absolutely. And who's the reporter that has done the yeoman's work on this? Just Jesse Kelly?
I don't think Jesse Kelly's a reporter.
No, it's something.
Byron York has done a lot of stuff on it.
No, it's somebody Kelly. Julie Kelly?
Julie Kelly.
I think it's Julie Kelly. And she has done the absolute yeoman's work on going through all this stuff, pulling out the relevant parts and pointing to the obvious inconsistencies between testimony and the facts on the ground. She's done and I just want her to get credit for all the work she has done. And she exposed even that apparently there were like 15 boxes being held by the National Archives that Trump was told to pick up. How many of the classified documents were just kind of salted in there somewhere? I mean, we don't know, but we don't have any proof yet because they mixed up the boxes and they mixed up how they were found. But it sure leads to a reasonable suspicion that there was some sort of collusion here to set Trump up. And given everything else that the government has done, it wouldn't surprise me in the least. But we don't have any proof. I want to state that clearly. We don't know that that's what happened, but there is a lot of circumstantial evidence to give that sheen to it.
Yeah. So, when we talk about this delay, part of the reason for this delay is actually the state of the evidence. And the motions made by not only by Trump, but by Walt Nauta's lawyers that says, hey, this is not the state this stuff was in. These pictures are wrong. These weren't all the boxes. And then, of course, there's the admix of boxes from the National Archives. How many of those had classified documents in it? And by the way, if there were any, that's the National Archives' fault.
That's exactly right. I remember they've swept up a large number of people into this probe, including like the butler. Like just some like random people who happen to be, working there. This is a classic divide and conquer. Let's sweep up everybody, and then we'll peel them off one at a time, which is exactly what they did during the impeachment trials, exactly what they have done in every other single trial against Donald Trump, is they've just done a shotgun smatter of indictments against all kinds of people who have, some of them, Michael Flynn, for example, he went bankrupt because of nothing. He was only in the NSA seat for, a week?
Yeah. And it took him years to go through that process. And he lost almost everything.
Yeah. Had to sell his house. Used up all his insurance. It's hell. And they've done this to the lawyers who have represented Trump at different stages of different, complaints. This is an all-out federal government harassment of a private citizen. It's absolutely disgusting, anti-American, and I would say treasonous. And the problem that the FBI and the Department of Justice faces is they have to try him, and they have to get a conviction before the election. Right.
Because the second he gets elected president, the second he assumes office, assuming that that's what happens, this all goes away. Everything goes on hold for 4 years. Assuming he doesn't.
Oh, if not forever.
He can discontinue. He doesn't pardon himself.
Right.
Because
that would be, that would be perfect. That would be the perfect sort of season-ending cliffhanger for a Trump presidency, a second Trump presidency. A Grover Cleveland type presidency.
I am a defender of traditional norms. However, even though no president has ever done it, I frankly think it would be hilarious, since there is no explicit ban in the Constitution against it. I think it would be hilarious if Donald Trump were to be elected and were to end all this by just pardoning himself. I pardon myself for all crimes I may or may not have committed.
That only counts for federal crimes. It wouldn't get him out of the wash for, like the New York stuff.
Yeah, but it certainly would get him out of the classified case and the...
which is stupid.
And the case that's currently on hold because of the immunity claim. Which, by the way, that's
in fact, the classified case against Biden is way stronger. Biden had no...
Biden had no
decertification.
Right. Yeah, Biden had no right to possess the documents. He had documents all the way back from when he was a senator, which means he stole them from a skiff.
Yep, that's the only way he could have them.
So, and he gets to walk.
And and her found that he possessed them willfully and against the law.
He was just too old and senile to be tried. That was essentially he broke the law.
It's the Hillary defense.
Yeah, exactly. And he gets away with it, but Donald Trump can't. And of course, now that we know that the state of the evidence, and that's the other thing, the state of the evidence is so confusing. How does Judge Cannon rule without an additional investigation into exactly what went wrong with that evidence, where those pictures came from, why those affidavits say what they say? This is a morass now.
Yes. And that's precisely why she's had to postpone this, because while there are a certain known number of pretrial motions coming, there's going to be others. There's going to be appeals. And this isn't unusual. These kind of cases typically take 3 or 4 years, just because you have to afford the defense every defense it has. And that includes interlocutory appeals, which means in the middle of the case, there's no final decision yet, but there is some decision made that might potentially be appealable. They aren't all appealable.
Well, that's happening to the other case right now, where we're now
Right.
having to wait for the Supreme Court to figure out what exactly the level of immunity for a president is for official acts. That case is going nowhere, and it's going to go nowhere until the Supreme Court rules on it, which may not happen until August.
Well, no, it'll happen by the end of June. That's when they deliver their decisions. Then they go on recess until the October term. But it's not going to be a satisfactory decision for anybody, quite honestly. This is not. The problem is that there's too much politics mixed up with this legal reasoning, and it makes it very, very difficult. It's not the kind of thing that really should be before the Supreme Court, although I agree that at this stage it should be, just because of the way the prosecution is working. It should have never gone this far, ever.
No, and I think it's telling that in both of these cases, Jack Smith was trying to get a pre-election trial and verdict.
Mm-hmm.
And if it was anybody but Donald Trump, the idea that you would be able to have a 6-month trial date and, 8 months later would have a conviction is a pretty unreasonable expectation anyway. As you mentioned a few minutes ago, these cases can go 3 or 4 years. So
Yeah.
you can't file a case in January and then expect it to be all cleared up before Election Day in November. I mean, that was just
I mean, federal murder cases can go 8-10 years, easy.
Yeah, so this is all, it's the unseemly haste. Now, granted, they didn't have a choice. If the guy gets reelected, this all goes away, one way or another. And so they didn't really have a choice but to try to compress this entire thing into a year. But in terms of the classified document case, you know that Judge Cannon is about to receive 30 or 40 motions to exclude, right?
Right.
All of which have to be ruled on and opinions written. This is
And briefed and argued, and that takes time. And again, it's not the only case she has. She's a federal district judge. She's got plenty on her plate.
and this is just one of the many that she has. Okay, well, let's switch over to, you mentioned it a little bit ago, what's going on in New York, Alvin Bragg's case in New York, which apparently now really comes down to whatever Michael Cohen says.
That's a shit case.
Jonathan Turley, you mentioned earlier, he actually did go out and say, this is all a bunch of BS. Alvin Bragg hasn't proved anything. And Michael Cohen, I mean, his defense, this is the thing I love. The witnesses that Alvin Bragg called all say that Cohen is basically an opportunist. And let's see, what was the Hope Hicks? Cohen liked to call himself a fixer, a role she said was only possible because he first broke it. Keith Davidson only worked with Cohen because he was a jerk whom his manager, along with everyone else, didn't want to deal with. I forget who it was they asked. Is he prone to exaggeration? Oh, yeah. And Cohen was just happy.
I think that was Pecker.
Yeah, exactly. And Cohen was perfectly happy about Trump right up until the point that he pled guilty. And then all of a sudden, he knew where all the bodies were buried. What we've got now is...
And remember, what he pled guilty to had nothing to do with Trump. One of the things was like abusing a taxi cab medallion or something illegal with a taxi cab medallion. I mean, it had nothing to do with Trump. I'm not saying he wasn't a sleazy lawyer. He's obviously a sleazy lawyer. And I'm not saying that that's not why... I mean, that's exactly why Trump hired him, because he was a sleazy lawyer, and he thought that he could use him for the right purposes. I mean, you're dealing in New York. It's not an easy town for a high-powered individual to throw your weight around without somebody a little greasy.
Yeah, well, right now, Alvin Bragg has Trump's signature on a couple of checks. What he doesn't have so far is Trump knew what those checks were for. Because, I mean,
even if he did, it doesn't.
Well,
matter.
that's
There's nothing illegal about signing an NDA. There's literally nothing illegal. And what he is banking on is turning this into a federal crime, which has already been decided by both the DOJ and the Federal Election Commission to not be a crime. He has no jurisdiction to argue this. So he's tried to tie it to this little New York statute. And it's just absolute bullshit. He has nothing, literally nothing. Apparently, anything that Donald Trump says is a threat to witnesses, to jurors, to judges. Anything he says is always a threat. He is the most powerful man in the world. Yeah. He just speaks and things happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's certainly the basis of the judge's gag order against him.
Which is also unconstitutional. And I'm surprised they haven't. I think they're waiting for the order to throw him in jail. And then they're going to appeal all of it. I mean, the $1,000, I mean, what is that? That's pocket change to Trump.
Yeah, but I mean, judges do issue gag orders. I mean, it is.
Yeah.
It is a thing that they do.
It is true. And what it's designed to do is to stop, especially defendants, but also prosecution from trying the case in the public square.
The media. It's
supposed to be before the jury and only before the jury. This kind of stuff where anything he says is somehow a threat against jurors, against the prosecution, against the judge. I mean, that's just malarkey, to borrow a Joe Biden term.
Well, the thing about this particular case, and yes, it does use this obscure election fraud law, state law that New York has, which we talked about several months ago whenever the case was first filed. And the idea is, look, it's not illegal to pay someone to sign an NDA.
Mm-hmm.
It's not illegal to ask them to sign an NDA. And if you give them money and they take it and they sign the NDA, that's all above board. The fraud comes in.
I mean, by definition, both parties reached an agreement.
Yeah, the fraud
They've
comes
agreed
in.
to this.
Right. And Bragg's argument is that the fraud comes in whenever, instead of recording the payment in your books as hush money to whore, you record the payment.
Which I don't remember that accounting. I got to look at QuickBooks. I don't remember that.
I don't think I have that in my chart of accounts. Hush money to whore, but I'm sure it's somewhere under miscellaneous expenses. But
I may need the mob version.
But it was recorded as legal fees,
which he paid to Michael Cohen. And what's really galling about this is that Hillary Clinton did this with the Steele dossier.
Yeah, her campaign certainly did. Yeah.
She paid for that Steele dossier and wrote it down as legal fees. She paid to get that story to the media, and it went down as legal fees.
I mean, technically, one could argue that since Michael Cohen was in charge of whore payments at the time, that paying him...
That was just his job.
That was just his job. Therefore, it is legal fees. But, even that is hard to argue in the Hillary Clinton case. And yet we don't care. We don't care. In fact, nobody even went to jail for any of that.
No. And you know what? Frankly, I don't think that Hillary should have gone to jail for that. I mean, it was sleazy and dirty. She should have paid a fine. And actually, she may have paid a fine, if I remember correctly. I think that's reasonable. Um, if they want Trump to pay a fine, okay, pay a stupid fine, whatever. It's kind of like when I was in college, when I started college, all the fraternities had a bit of a slush fund for when they got caught, having beer at rush parties. It's like, we're going to get caught, but we're still going to do it. So,
Yeah. By the way,
at least we'll have the funds to pay for it when we get caught.
by the way, I have a question for you from chat. Question for Michael. Judge Merchan seemed to admit that the testimony from Stormy went too far and stated that the defense should have objected more. Do judges have any responsibility to stop that?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think it's good jurisprudence for the judge, especially given the Harvey Weinstein case in New York that just got overturned because of improper testimony that was presented that had nothing to do with the elements of the case. It was just character assassination. Do the judges have a duty? It's a good question. I don't know that I'm prepared to answer that because I don't know what the judge's duty is in New York. In Virginia, it would be reversible error in the very least. I don't know that you could. I don't know the judge's canon would come into play, but the questioner's observation is absolutely correct that there was a lot of unnecessary and inflammatory testimony that was given that should not have been allowed. Those questions should not have been allowed. And I don't know what the defense's strategy is. So maybe they're, banking on they're going to lose here, so let's preserve as much for appeal as possible, and that's a pretty big appealable issue.
Maybe, but what you would expect during the actual cross-examination, when the question was answered, for a competent attorney to stand up and say objection, and
so when you're cross-examining, right? So when you're cross-examining, you can't actually object to the answer to your own questions. You open the door is basically how it's looked at under the law. So you either need to tailor your question better, or don't ask open-ended questions. You can't object to an answer. I mean, you can in certain circumstances. Don't get me wrong, but generally, you don't get to object to the answer that comes out of their mouth when you ask a question.
Okay, I was thinking these were prosecution questions that were asked. But
if on the prosecution yes, then the defense can object there. That's true.
I mean, obviously, you can't object to your own questions. Yes.
I mean, it happens, but yeah, it gets shut down pretty much all the time. Whether or not the defense should have objected more, again, I don't know what the strategy is. I kind of get the feeling there's a bit of a possum strategy here. To, we'll go through the motions. We're going to lose at the district court, and then we'll start making our case at the appellate court that none of this stuff should have been allowed, that it was impossible for a jury to reach this decision absent these extraneous testimony about things that had nothing to do with the actual crimes alleged.
Well, that's the other question I've been pondering. What is your strategy as a defense attorney when you are being tried in a venue where you are pretty well assured that
right,
you are going to lose. That it doesn't
What's
really.
the chicken strategy when he's being tried by a jury of foxes? Yes.
Exactly. So you already know you are going to lose at trial, and that the jury's determine. And this is the other problem. What do you do when you know that the jury is going to make determinations of fact that are just false?
Right.
Do you try to fight that at the trial, or do you just think this is a losing battle? We're going to be better off heading up to the New York Court of Appeals in Albany and hashing all this shit out there?
Well, part of it depends on how much money you have, but
let's assume that Donald Trump has enough money for an appeal.
It's very, very expensive to appeal. Even to file the appeal, you have to pay to have entire transcripts for however many judges are on the appellate court. In New York, I think it's 12. And so you got to pay for 12 entire transcripts plus, exhibits and all that stuff. That gets really expensive. And then you have to pay all the fees and you got to pay the bond. And I mean, it's not an easy thing. So with somewhat limitless resources, it's not a bad strategy to simply introduce the ability for the prosecution to fuck up and the judge. Give them some rope and allow them to make mistakes. If nothing else, it ties it up for years. And typically that's when some sort of settlement comes around.
Except this is a criminal case, so there's not going to be a settlement per se.
Well, there absolutely could be a settlement. It could be settled with a fine. Yeah. And they could settle with a fine.
But then he'd have to
Trump's
plead
not going
guilty.
to prison.
But then he'd have to plead guilty.
He may have to plead guilty to something. And I don't know that Trump would do that. But it depends on, what they think is best. To plead guilty to a minor charge of fixing the books, which is just a fine. You don't go to jail for that. Not even in New York. There may be some sort of agreement that they can come to. Who knows? What I do know is that the Trump team has been handed the ability to delay this thing for pretty much as long as they want. And I understand that he can't pardon himself for state crimes, but he can put it off for a really long time.
Well, if he were to be elected, even the state cases would come to a shuddering stop.
Yeah, they couldn't continue the cases, although they'd be sitting there.
Yeah, they'd be sitting there.
Got out.
They'd be sitting there until someone else became president. So for 4 years.
And that's the thing is once he's not president, how many resources are they going to really expend to go after him anymore?
Well,
because obviously the whole point is to prevent him from being president.
That's the thing. If he gets elected president again, he's ineligible to be president ever again. What's the point? I mean, unless your love for justice burns so bright that you can't leave this case alone, and you have to go after the ex-president now. But I think it's obvious that these cases, which do have, a not entirely, although almost, but not entirely unjustified legal basis, they have some justification to them. And they're using this simply to try to prevent him from being elected president. I mean, at the end of the day, even though you can say that there may be some truth to some of these allegations, they're not entirely out of left field. The fact is, we all know.
Stretch.
Yeah, but we all know why it's being done. So even if you want to make the argument, he cooked the books a little bit because he didn't want to write whore payments in the ledger, and he wrote legal fees instead. Okay, sure, you got me.
I almost kind of wish he had.
I do too. I wish he, well, I mean, I wouldn't have written down whore payments, but I would have written, payment to Stormy Daniels, $140,000 on signing an NDA.
I'm not sure he even knew that happened, though. And a matter of fact,
well, see,
the
that is the problem.
Child.
That is the problem. We don't have any evidence that Donald Trump knew what the actual details of this
he
were.
had. I mean,
or whether
there's been no evidence introduced at trial to show that he directed it or that he knew that it happened. Hecker,
that's the thing.
And Cohen both said, "Yeah, we dealt with each other." So where's Donald Trump?
So where's Donald Trump? Sure, he's sitting at his desk. Somebody says, "Hey, Mr. Trump, this is a payment we have to pay to Cohen for $60,000." He writes a check and he moves on with his day. And so far, there's no evidence that he knew anything other than he had a check that he had to sign, and he signed it. And by the way, I think he only signed 2 of the 6 checks that are at issue. I think the other 4 were either signed by Eric Trump or one of
maybe Weinstein.
Yeah, or Eric Trump I know signed at least 1, maybe 2. And then I think Weinstein signed the rest. There's no.
Well, he was Trump's right-hand man. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, how much did Trump actually keep up with on a day-to-day basis? I mean, did Trump say?
I mean, the guy's dealing with deals all around the world. I'm sure that he is. Trump is sharp. He's obviously very smart. And he is a control freak. So
yeah, there is.
I'm sure that he had some inkling about what was going on, but not a provable one.
It's more like,
I mean, I think it's reasonable to assume that he knew what was going on, but you got to prove that when you're prosecuting him for a criminal liability.
It could have been something very much akin to the King of England about, St. Thomas a Becket. Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? And a couple of guys said, yeah, we can do that.
Oh, we'll do it.
I mean, they didn't tell anybody. It happened. I mean, technically, the king asked for something to be done, but did he direct it? No. And now there is word that there is a audio recording of Trump discussing it.
Yeah, from Michael Cohen. But it should not be admissible. Well, I guess the exception would be if it's in furtherance of a crime. But Michael Cohen's never been charged with that crime. And he's not charged here. And you need another witness under a conspiracy charge who's not involved. So I don't know how they could prove that.
Well, I mean, if it's Trump saying, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to pay you $130,000, and then you're going to pay her, and then we'll market all his legal fees. It'll be
just so I can keep my books clean, because I'm really big about keeping my books clean.
Yeah, so well,
it's just so ridiculous.
We'll see how that one goes.
Actually, there's been some people who have said it, and I'm being swayed towards that all you need is one juror to say, yeah, this is kind of bullshit, and you get a mistrial.
Yeah, sure. Can you find that one juror in Manhattan?
I mean, it's possible. You got to love Trump. That guy is the best politician since Bill Clinton. He's on trial. He goes out for lunch, during the break, and brings pizza to the firemen, goes down and visits a bunch of union guys building something, brings them food, hobnobs with them. I mean,
and then shows up in Jersey
an
on the
incredible retail politician,
and then just
and
shows
then,
up
oh my
in
God,
Jersey
this
on
was
the
crazy.
weekend.
Yeah, this was absolutely crazy.
Now, I disagree with this headline. Jersey Shore swamped with 80,000 MAGA supporters. Okay, true. As Trump gets nasty, brands Biden a total moron. I'm not sure I would characterize that as getting nasty as much as I would being factual, but okay. But he shows up and gets 80.
That's the Irish girl, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the Irish girl. But he shows up at the Jersey Shore. Apparently, according to his campaign officials, okay, so maybe not 80,000, but still tens of thousands of people showing up in Jersey.
In Avalon.
Yeah.
So Avalon is down in southern Jersey, past Ocean City, which is about, I don't know, almost 2/3 of the way down. Avalon south of that, and it's got a boardwalk with all these, carnival rides and stuff. Very popular place, especially during the summer. It's like when I grew up in Delaware, that was where we went for senior beach week, after we graduated. It's an incredibly popular
comment from
place.
chat. Wildwood.
So he hit. Say it again.
Comment from chat. Wildwood of all places. Traffic must have been terrible.
Yeah, Wildwood is, and traffic I'm sure was absolutely terrible because the roads there suck and they're all 2-lane roads.
So maybe not the best place to hold a rally, but still, 80,000. Some are saying 100,000. I don't know that we actually know what the actual number is, but it was certainly
it was more than the
crowd.
40 or so that show up to a Biden rally.
Yeah.
Wearing masks.
By 40, you mean 40 people, not 40,000 people. I guess my question about this is, it was a rally. It was a Trump rally. Who cares? It doesn't actually tell us anything. Well, it does tell us one thing. It tells us the extent of intensity of support for the people who are going to vote for Donald Trump. It tells us how high the intensity of that support is. What it doesn't speak to is the likelihood.
We saw that in 2020 as well.
Yeah, is what it doesn't point to is the likelihood of him actually winning.
That's right.
We often use, crowd sizes as some sort of proxy for popularity. And
right.
In normal circumstances with a normal politician who doesn't quite have the level of personal loyalty or trust or whatever you want to call it that Donald Trump has, it might, in that case, if it was Mitt Romney, right, it might indicate some level of general support for Mitt Romney, who is a politician that I dare say no one has any deep personal interest in his victory. When you have someone like Donald Trump, where people are, I'm trying to look for a non-pejorative synonym for insanely dedicated to, but people who really, really strongly support Donald Trump, they'll show up at rallies and they'll show up and vote, by the way, make no mistake about it. But is that...
And they'll actually drag people to vote with them.
Yeah, but does that count to 50%? That's always
I don't think
question.
I don't think that is a necessary correlation.
I don't either.
It does show strong support amongst a base. And the base for Donald Trump is very strong.
Sure.
There are a lot of wishy-washy people. Like us, I suppose, although I will never vote for Biden.
No, impossible.
And I'm going to vote for Trump. I just will. But there are plenty of wishy-washy people who don't like either candidates, don't like the choices that are presented to them, and I agree with them 100%. However, I've only got two choices.
It's a binary.
And there's nothing I can do about that.
Well, I mean, there's always Mary Ann
Williamson. Nothing that I
Williamson.
do that's going to change that.
There's always Mary Ann Williamson, of course, or RFK
Or
Jr.
Robert, right? With the dead worm in his brain.
Yeah, this is, Donald Trump is an unusual politician in that he does have such strong support for the base. So, but look at the big numbers.
Well, he's very much like, who was it? William Jennings Bryan, the populist candidate from, the Midwest.
Yeah, who had insane support from his base.
I mean, incredible support.
And won nothing.
And won nothing. That's exactly right. But he did his, rallies or whatever they were called back then, they were insanely popular. He was a barnstormer across the Midwest. But he never penetrated any of the real population centers, Chicago, New York, Boston, Philly. He just was not able to reach that far into those areas. The farmers, the Midwest, the oil workers, they were down.
The South,
William Jennings Bryan. In the South, they were down with him, but he couldn't reach the actual, population centers. Trump has been able to go beyond that, and he's already done it once. I don't think it's beyond reason that he can do it again, especially given how miserably the Biden administration has handled really everything, especially the economy.
Oh, we're going to get to at least one aspect of Joe Biden's idiocy. Yeah. Although we're talking about this stuff, longer than I thought we would, but I think it's a productive conversation. I think I try to think of it when I sort of do my internal analysis in numbers, which is that Donald Trump has, as we saw during the primaries, Donald Trump has a lock on about 45% of the Republican electorate. However,
maybe a little less, but yeah, I think that's right.
35
to
45.
An absolute solid lock on about 40. Yeah, I think that's right.
So let's say 40% of the Republican electorate. Sounds good. And then you realize that nationwide Republicans make up less than 30% of voter registration. 40% of the electorate are non-committed. They're independent.
But then you look at places like Pennsylvania, a battleground state, where Republican registrations are outpacing Democratic registrations, especially in Western Pennsylvania. The biggest problem for Trump is in especially in Philly, where we know cheating is going to happen. It always happens. It will continue to happen because nobody will stop it. That's where the bulwark for the left exists, is in Philly. But he is reaching, just like I remember vividly in 2016 when we were watching the Rust Belt Initiative pan out, from Tennessee all the way up through Kentucky, Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, Michigan, Indiana. We watched it happen, and once that happened, we were like, "Well, that's it. He's won."
Yeah, there's no way Hillary can win now.
Right.
The Democrats need Pennsylvania or Florida, but of course, Florida, as far as I can tell, not in play in 2024.
It will not be in play.
Florida is a red state at this point.
Their best bets for the Democrats are North Carolina, and that's slipping away.
Pennsylvania, looking iffy. Michigan,
and Wisconsin. That's their stopgap. I mean, they're not going to win the middle of the country. I mean, from Texas on up to North Dakota, that's just red.
Yeah, and if they lose Pennsylvania, it's hard to see how. I mean, we might end up with 271 and 271, or 270 and 270.
That'd be fun. We haven't had that since Andrew Jackson, and
we'd have to go to the House. And if we go to the House,
right.
If we go to the House, Trump wins.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, each state gets a vote, and it'll be all over but the shouting. So I guess my concern is that 40% of 30% is not a majority, right? 40% of the Republican Party's 30% voter registration, that's not a majority. That's not even 15% of the electorate.
Now remember, not all of them are Republican voters. I mean, I'm not. I'm not a registered Republican. I'm an
neither am I.
I will never register for a party. And he's winning independents. I mean, it's within the margin of error. I think it's maybe 5 or 6 points, but he's winning independents, and he's starting to sway some Democratic voters, especially former Biden voters. And where he's getting it is mostly amongst Hispanics and Black people.
Look, Biden had a couple of advantages in 2020 that he's not going to have in 2024.
Pandemic.
Number one, a pandemic where we just decided the state legislature's rules on how we handle elections are a bunch of bullshit. We're going to do what we want. And so we have this massive mail-in and early voting and all of this other stuff that were just absolute violations of state law in some place. Pennsylvania, great example. We now know that they just blatantly broke state law. Of course, it was a year after the election.
Which wasn't ruled on until well after the election. So, and this is what I love. Well, but Trump lost all those cases, and they said he didn't have. No, what they ruled was they didn't have a remedy to offer. It wasn't that his case was bad. It was that the courts were not empowered to make a ruling. They didn't have the authority. And I think that's mostly right for most of the state courts. It's a limited jurisdiction. I mean, there's not much you can do about that, and, except without the legislature. But when it came to after the election and these cases were pursued, that was illegal. We found that out in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, even in Georgia. And where in Georgia, just recently, we found that Fulton County has somehow misplaced 380 plus thousand voting images that they ran through over 3,000 ballots twice. This was not an election that was on the up and up, despite the assurances from Greg Jarrett and whoever the IT guy was under Trump. This was not on the up and up. I'm not saying I don't want to go down that road, but it was not on the up and up. There were definitely hinky things. Even
if we were to accept arguendo that there was no explicit cheating, right? I mean, nobody was taking your ballots, throwing them away, and replacing them with fake ballots that they wrote. Even if we assume that, the fact is that we changed the rules in the middle of the game. And that alone, and now that the courts have said, yes, you should not have changed those rules in the middle of the game, that alone raises questions about the security and legitimacy of the process. And the federal courts have already said that. By the way, we are probably now in violation of YouTube's terms of service by
probably they're going to come after us again. Okay.
So we'll probably get our first strike on this. But okay.
But what's even more than that, though?
But it wasn't just that the rules were bad. I mean, Biden's other advantage was that he had a lot of name recognition, but he was not associated with being the moron that Joe Biden is. He was just...
Well, that's the media's fault.
He was just sort of, standard
Uncle
Democratic
Joe.
politician here. And so he's this inoffensive Democrat. Everybody kind of thinks of him as middle of the road. And what Joe Biden has always been is an opportunist who tries to figure out where the center of gravity is in the Democratic Party and stake out a position there. And if the party moves left, he'll move left. If it moves right, he'll move right. He is a man of no particular conviction. And to the extent that he does have conviction, his instincts are almost invariably wrong. But nobody knew that about Joe. And people were tired of
Well, Robert Gates did.
Yeah, well, Robert Gates did. People were tired of mean tweets. Joe seemed like inoffensive, standard Democratic politician. And
he was generic Democrat.
Yeah, he was generic
That's
Democrat.
how he was presented.
And so Trump loses against generic Democrat. Trump won against one of the most disliked
Worst retail politicians
and
ever.
Worst retail politicians in 2016. And I think his advantage going into 2024 is that we're back to the normal election rules, which means a lot of these shenanigans that went on are not going to go on again. And second of all,
and people
now know Joe Biden.
You know, we've had almost 4 years of Joe Biden. We had 4 years of Trump and things were better. That everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. It's not even a question. You know, they keep trying to talk up this economy, which is shit, and it's going to get shittier. That's all they have is gaslighting and lies.
And the economy aside, the one thing that's happened this week that I wanted to bring up as, just one single data point on how bad Joe Biden and his administration's instincts actually are, is now they're going after the Israelis for, basically genocide, killing more civilians than terrorists. In fact, I think, who was it? Israel? Yeah. Bernie Sanders, now we'll go back to that, but Bernie Sanders is basically just saying Israel is breaking international law and he wants to cut off all support to Israel. Okay, well, Bernie's a commie. Who cares what he thinks? Well, apparently the Biden administration, because now they're kind of parroting that.
They're pretty commie.
And by the way, let us assume that it's true. And by the way, the Israelis say this too. The Israelis have said basically for every terrorist that we're killing, about 1.25 civilians are also being caught in the crossfire. And that is indeed tragic. However, let's go back a few years to our retaking of Fallujah in Iraq, where the best number we can come up with is that we killed 4 civilians for every militant that we killed in Iraq. I mean,
I'm not sure that's a good excuse, but okay.
No, but I'm just saying it's not an excuse. It is the reality of ground combat in any sort of urban environment. It's impossible.
Urban warfare, especially when the enemy is embedding themselves amongst civilians.
It is impossible to conduct operations without civilian casualties, sometimes even massive ones. And let's not even talk about World War II and the dehousing campaign of our daylight bombing.
That's exactly right. Back when we actually used to do war right. Yeah. No. Israel is doing this exactly the way it should be done.
They've taken hundreds of casualties by going door to door. They're taking as much effort as I think anyone has ever taken, and perhaps more, to reduce the number of civilian casualties. Because quite frankly, if Israel just wanted to kill the Palestinians, there is nothing we could do to stop them.
There's nothing anybody could do to stop them.
They could simply carpet bomb Rafah, and they don't need any of our advanced technology to do it. They could do it with dumb bombs. So,
although it's really interesting that we withheld, apparently the Biden administration withheld intelligence that could have ended this war a lot more earlier. And why? What was the point in withholding that? I mean, some people are calling this treasonous. That doesn't make any damn sense. But it is certainly a betrayal of an ally. And it is certainly against what the Congress has uh, approved, just like the withholding of these smart bombs and stuff.
First of all,
why would you do that unless you're on the side of Hamas?
I don't think Joe Biden cares about Hamas or Israel. What Joe Biden cares about are his political fortunes.
Good point.
And I think the message of the Biden administration is, no matter how good an ally you are and how long we have had historic ties with you, if it's better for Joe Biden politically, we will abandon you instantly.
Wasn't there somebody impeached for this? I swear to God. There was something about getting impeached for withholding funds unless there was some quid pro quo. My memory fails me.
Yeah, that's one of the Trump impeachments, of course. But Biden can do it. Apparently, it's not a problem. But Biden does it because that's what his base wants.
He did it with Ukraine too, and admitted to it on tape.
Yeah, unless you fire that prosecutor. You're not getting the money, and they fired the prosecutor, and they got the money.
And this is, I think this is the itch that is under so many people's saddle, that there's just a two-tier system here. There is no equality before the law. We're not all equal Americans. We don't have the same privileges and immunities. Certain people have far more privileges and immunities. Certain people are above the law despite their protestations otherwise. They get away with absolute, again, I don't want to say treasonous, but certainly vile and villainous
I would go so far as to say seditious.
And administrations.
I would go so far as to say seditious. Treason is specifically defined in the Constitution. So,
well, and again, it's not against our country; it's against another country. So I can't see it as treasonous. But seditious, when you're going against the act and the will of Congress, you don't get that choice. We are a federal government of limited powers, and those powers are limited to what is in the Constitution. Congress overrides that far too often,
routinely. Yeah,
but the president has very, very strict confines. And what he's doing has been so far the what's the Latin term? Extra vires. It's beyond the power. And he does it with impunity.
Yeah, I mean, look, Congress passed, for better or for worse, Congress passed a resolution, which the president signed, which made it the law that we were going to give X amount of support to Israel. You don't get to pull a Richard Nixon now and do takesies backsies. We're not gonna give him that stuff, even though Congress has appropriated it.
The anti-deficiency law says you can't do that.
That is a violation of American law. He has an obligation to send everything that Congress has appropriated in a timely fashion, and refuses to do that. And you said something a few minutes ago when I mentioned the dehousing campaign, and that's literally what we called it. That's what the Air Force referred to it as, dehousing. The idea was to bomb civilian cities to destroy all the housing in that city.
It was the way we used to conduct war.
Yes.
Before the end of World War II, we put people into submission. You either submit and unconditional surrender, or you die. That's it. You only get two choices.
We have somehow, and I'm sure this is a fundamental cultural change.
It is
that we have somehow lost sight of the idea that even in the best of circumstances, war is going to be extraordinarily nasty and brutal, and people are going to die, and there is going to be a boatload of tragedy associated with it, even in the best and most limited of wars. But at the end of the day, the type of war that you have is largely determined and I hate to say this, but it's largely, and we talked about this, I think, a week or two ago, it's going to be a race to the bottom because of reciprocity. If you have an enemy that is going to intentionally break all the laws of warfare, and then you assume, which we often do, and this is what we're doing with Israel and Hamas right now, you assume that you have an absolute duty to abide by the rules of warfare, even when fighting someone who routinely disobeys them, then you are building an equation for losing the war. The only way that you can win is via reciprocity. And as I said a couple of weeks ago, sure, there are bounds that we will not morally cross, but we will ensure, we have to ensure, in order to have a victory against an evil enemy, you have to ensure that they pay a price for their violation of those laws of war. And unfortunately, that often means that civilians are going to have to pay that price with them. And we make this distinction. Well, wait a second. The Palestinian civilians are not really related to Hamas, which I would buy if it wasn't for the fact that those same Palestinian civilians, when given the choice, chose Hamas to be their government.
They didn't flee Palestine.
And
they could have left. And they didn't. And they didn't want to, because they support the idea of eliminating Israel altogether and the West.
And by the way, I don't think people in the West understand this love affair that the Palestinians have with death. They
don't understand Hamas or Hezbollah or the Iranians in the least. These are explicitly Marxist revolutionary entities. The reason that Jordan has never accepted the millions of Palestinian refugees who are in their country as countrymen is because same reason they were kicked out of every other country, every other Arab country, is because they're Marxist revolutionaries. This is a Marxist revolutionary war. That's what we're facing. And we're facing it here in our country too.
By the way, I think the government of Jordan still holds the record for most Palestinians killed in a single military action.
Yeah, that's right.
Because when Yasser Arafat got a little too uppity in Jordan, the king of Jordan sent the army in and they slaughtered the Palestinians. I mean, without a second thought. And here's the other thing that really bothers me. We talk about...
This is why Jordan is actually a friend of the United States.
The other thing that really bothers me when people talk about, well, Hamas says 30,000 have been killed. And they assume that that's all civilians, which it's not. Again, it's
all children, women and children. Yeah. It's the only people that die in Palestine are women and children.
Okay, now do Syria, where 30,000 is the quarterly death toll in the Arab-on-Arab conflict that has been going on there for nearly a decade now. Why don't we care about that?
Yeah.
And that is actually the civilian death toll. But nobody cares about that.
It's specifically on civilians.
Yes, and it's been ongoing for years. Who's weeping about that in the UN General Assembly? The answer is no one.
Nobody.
And
although they did find some time this week to grant Palestine, which isn't even a fucking country, some special privileges. Not voting privileges yet, but kind of like Eleanor Holmes Norton,
yeah, the DC
from DC, who she gets to have her say, but she doesn't have an actual vote.
Yeah, well, I just everything the Biden administration does is wrong.
Of course, the Human Rights Campaign or the Human Rights Commission at the UN is, I think, currently headed by Iran.
Yes, and Iran a nation that is famously respectful, of course, of human rights.
Third world debating club. That's all it is. It's been a failure from the start. It has never stopped any war. It should be abolished. We should withdraw, kick them out of Turtle Island, and make them go away.
You know, the UN kind of was condemned to irrelevance the second we decided Russia, France, Britain, China, and the U.S. all had veto power over anything it did.
Right.
Pretty much in short, it would never be anything more than a debating society. And by the way, we wouldn't have even gone to war in Korea if the Russians hadn't been boycotting the UN at the time. Because they would have vetoed the Korean War, and we never would have been there. In any event, Michael, it's about time for us to shut this thing down.
That was quick.
Yeah, it does seem to go by fast, doesn't it?
We had a lot to say.
Yeah, well, talking takes up time, and it takes it up faster than you think it does. Have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.
See you later.
You've been watching the Observations podcast. Wow, that music got a lot more heavy metal faster than I thought it would. You've been watching the Observations podcast for the 12th of May, 2024. As always, we appreciate the fact that you do. We'll look forward to speaking with you again next week. Until then, have a great week. So long.